over to another session, 4 minutes late, but I think time well spent. We need to quickly move on to our book launch session. I'll hand it over to Jesse Thorson. He's a sustainability and ESG strategist at Third Partners, a boutique management consultancy working for positive change. Previously, he was a program manager at the Center for Sustainable Development, Columbia University Earth Institute, and a dear colleague, where he managed to do a lot of research and convening initiatives at the intersection of religion, ethics, and sustainability. Another angle that we don't really get to hear. So I think this is going to be a fascinating panel to see how ethics, religion, and sustainability can come together, and what is the lesson that educators need to learn on how to think about these different aspects. And Jesse is also co-editor of Ethics in Action for Sustainable Development, and this panel is organized based on this book. Jesse, over to you and to your panelists.
Thanks so much, Radhika. Hi, dear and esteemed colleagues and panelists. Good afternoon. Greetings from New York. So I don't need to say anything about myself after Radhika's wonderful introduction. I'll just say that I'm delighted to be here with some dear colleagues of mine and important thinkers and contributors to this discussion. As Radhika said, this panel is taking place in the context of a recently published book. It's the outcome of over 2 years of meetings at the Pontifical Academy of Social Sciences in Vatican City. These meetings were organized by the UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network and the Center for Sustainable Development at Columbia. And it brought together religious leaders, philosophers, theologians, scientists, and expert practitioners from different fields to discern the possibility of a multi-religious ethical consensus on the SDGs. So that's a mouthful. Our panelists have all contributed to this book and have participated in at least one, if not many, meetings at the Pontifical Academy. And we're going to hear 10 minutes of remarks from each of them, and then we're going to close with some moderated discussion and Q&A. So feel free to just drop that in the chat. That's probably going to be the best way to do this. Without further ado, our first speaker is going to be Professor Maryanne Wolf. Professor Wolf is an advocate for children and literacy around the world, and she directs UCLA's Center for Dyslexia, Diverse Learners, and Social Justice. Professor Wolf.
Thank you so much. As I told Jesse, it's the first time that I've lived in LA, which is a short amount of time, where I went outside and it's snowing. So I'm very worried about the internet connection, so he made me first. So if anything goes wrong, it's the weather. But first of all, it's such a pleasure to be with all of you today. And I want to begin with actually the last line in my chapter. And then I'm going to do some screens, since I'm a cognitive neuroscientist, and to show the brain, it makes a lot more sense than me just telling you about it. But I want to begin with what Pope Francis said about children. Children are a sign. They are a sign of hope, a sign of life, but also a diagnostic sign, a marker indicating the health of families, society, and the entire world. And indeed, what I'd like to suggest to you, I'm going to do my share screen, is that literacy is also a diagnostic sign. And I want very much, even though it's going to be a very quick 10-minute look at the reading brain, I want to do that for you so that, let's see here, I get this back. Sometimes it works more easily than others. Okay, there we are. I hope you see that. So what I'm going to be doing is talking about how literacy in our world is literally changing the brains of the individuals who become literate. My work connects neuroscience, but it connects across disciplines, including philosophy and ethics and literature and linguistics. And I look at this moment in our species as one of the three big, if you will, hinge moments. And in this hinge moment, we are all involved in moving from a print-based culture to a digital culture. And there are things we must consider. I was listening to the last presenters, and I wish I'd been here even longer, because so much of our work on education has to understand what are the implications of how we read, not just what we read. And so I'm going to be talking about the challenges of digital technology. And also, of course, we all know so much about the advantages, but it's my job to actually, in 10 minutes, give you a sense of the extraordinary capacities for thought that literacy gives us that we need to consider as we give different mediums to our children. And I begin with my colleague from MIT, Sherry Turkle, because she said this so well. We transgress, not because we try to build what is innovative, but because we do not allow ourselves to consider what it disrupts or diminishes. So my job, in a way, Tony will remember that I used Nicholas of Cusa, the philosopher, who said when there are two contradictory thoughts, what we need that could be equally true, what we need is to go above them and take a stance of learned ignorance to bring to bear what we know about these two different truths. And so my job, if you will, with you, is to open up perhaps a different direction of thought about education and about literacy and about our children. So the first important concept is that literacy changes the brain, which changes the individual, the society, and the species. The second thought is that it's all begun to change in ways that many of us do not understand. We barely perceive in ourselves that we are no longer as immersed as we once were in reading. Why? What are the implications? What are the implications not just for education, but for democracy itself? And so I want you just to take a very quick look at this diagram in which I show what the brain actually has that's genetically programmed that the reading brain has to connect. And here is the strange epiphany I once had. The human brain was never born to read. So when we build it, we are building a circuit that's plastic that will represent different languages. If you, all of you, I'm sure speak one or two different languages. Well, the writing system changes the circuit in small ways, sometimes in large ways, especially in our local syllabaries like Chinese and part of Japanese kanji. We really have a brain that is beautifully malleable, but it's malleable not only for the writing system, but for the medium. And so to understand what we have to think about when we are building curricula, whatever the medium, we need to understand what is going on in that reading brain that is so important for, if you will, just societies, sustainable societies, societies that have empathy and perspective taking and that are not as, if we will, as polarized as society is becoming, and in part becoming that way because of the effect of the amount of digital information that's available that is bombarding so many of us. So I want you just to very, very quickly look at the kind of skills that what we want to bring to all our children in education. These are called the deep reading processes. It begins with background knowledge, making an analogy from what we know to what we see. How can we be building that? Second, very, very importantly, background knowledge is, Alberto Mangel said this so much better, is this geometric progression. The more we know, the more able we are to understand what comes next, and we build upon it. But at the same time, we're not just building knowledge, we're building perspectives of others. One of the most missing aspects, and this is both ethical as well as neurological, we are at this moment in time in danger of not utilizing the full circuit's use of perspective taking. Now, this is a thought I want you to just very briefly consider. Those of us who only go to one familiar source of information are not getting other perspectives. That human brain, when it reads, is when it's doing its best, is leaving the self, taking on the perspective of others, thinking about other theories of that of our feelings that gives us both empathy and compassion for others, but also knowledge. So our brain is literally changing as we do that. Now, one of the most important things, and I have to go back just slightly, one of the most important things we do is to add this background knowledge, this perspective taking, to inference, deduction, critical analysis. One of the most important aspects that we need to give our children, regardless of medium, is the ability to think about the truth or the lack of truth in what is being encountered in the text. And that has been so misused and abused currently. And I'm going to put in something that Monsignor Sanchez, the organizers would love to hear this Aristotle, so I have to put a tiny bit of Aristotle in here. But it responds to both the good reader and the good society. A culture can be judged by how it pursues three lives: the life of activity, productivity, enjoyment, leisure, entertainment, and the life of contemplation. Our reading brain, when it pulls together those deep reading processes, gives way to what I call, and Aquinas called, the contemplative function that human beings have. This requires time. Now, if you look at this tiny little diagram, you see this is the activated brain that we possess. But it's a neuropsychological principle is use it or lose it. When we are on our digital devices, we are not necessarily utilizing the full activated regions of the deep reading brain. We are not necessarily, we are skimming, word spotting, etc., but we are not necessarily using what we possess to truly think. And this is because every medium has its costs and its weaknesses, and the weakness in the affordances of the digital medium. And we have to think about this because so much of our good work in teaching literacy is on digital devices. We have to be able to think, how do we propel deep reading on all the devices, and especially for those children who only have digital devices. And we've been working with them in Ethiopia. Curious Learning has been working on this in South Africa and many different places. So what I am trying to use is an insight by Walter Ong, who some of you know was Marshall McLuhan's student. And he said, you know, when we are in these moments where things seem in opposition, what our real task is to understand the generation who is steeped in both mediums, both cultures. So here we are in this great, wonderful hinge moment, but we have to use all our best knowledge, I believe, of the reading brain in order to have digital wisdom in our next generation and in the work we are doing in sustainability. So thank you. Please forgive me for, reading brain 101 in 10 minutes, but I hope it just sparked some of the thoughts that you might have. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Maryanne. I'm sure we'll come back to that in some Q&A if you're able to weather the storm out there with your internet. Our next speaker is Professor Anna Sun. Professor Sun is a sociologist and professor of religious studies at Duke University, and her scholarly work focuses on Confucianism and contemporary religious life. So Anna, over to you.
Hello, everyone. Warm greetings. Thank you, Maryanne, for fabulous presentation. And how wonderful it is to be part of this great community of thinkers and doers together. I am deeply honored to be here. So what I'm going to share with you is something that is both ancient and contemporary. When we think about Chinese society, we think of a society that is, perhaps for many, atheist. But the truth is that China is far from atheist. There are vibrant religious communities all over China, Christians, Buddhists, Muslims, These groups often face different difficulties politically, including Confucian communities. And what's fascinating about Confucianism is that although people may not say, I am a Confucian, the majority of the Chinese live a very Confucian life, both in terms of their ritual activities and their ethical systems. And a lot of this Confucian way of life is transmitted through moral education. So if you ask me how to understand Confucianism, I wouldn't say, well, just go to this Confucius temple and you understand it, because that's not actually going to be the best way to grasp the essence of Confucianism. I would say to you, talk to perhaps a mother who teaches her children about Confucian, the Confucian way of life. So what I'm going to share with you is summaries of some of the key ideas in the Confucian moral education tradition, transmitted in schools, of course. That is why, by the way, teachers have the highest status, at least symbolically for many people, because they are the ones training their children to be good people, not just learned, but also moral persons. But moral education also takes place at home, in communities, in our engagement with one another. So I'm going to do a share of a PowerPoint. Let's see if I'm able to put up. And Jessie, would you mind letting me know if
you should be able to.
Over time? All right, great. Let me try again. And Jessie, please feel free to let me know if I'm a little over time, so I will be able to stop. So learning to be moral and care about the common good in the Confucian tradition. Sorry. Okay, are you able to see it, Jessie?
Try the play from start button at the top left.
Got you. Excellent. Thank you. So what matters in life? The book we co-authored talks about happiness. We think about the pursuit of happiness as the most important goal in a society. There are other terms we use to describe something like happiness: well-being, flourishing, eudaimonia, or for people who are religious, blessings, blessed happiness. But in the Confucian tradition, one is not happy unless one cares about the common good. The common good is a foundation of all of these values we care about: happiness, well-being, flourishing, eudaimonia, and blessings. So the Confucian worldview states that the self is not just this consciousness in my head, this brain in my head, the neurons firing in absolutely miraculous directions, and I am what I think and I am what I feel. The Confucian worldview is that the self is always relational. The self is always constitutive of social relations. So I am Anna, but I'm also a daughter. I am a family member. I'm a spouse. I may be a sibling. I may be a parent. I am certainly a friend. I am a teacher. It is in those relations that I am who I am. So the 5 most important human relations in a Confucian form of good life includes meaningful relations between spouses, between parents and children, between siblings, between friends, and between, in the old formulation, subject and ruler. Today we speak of citizen and state, or even citizen and citizen. So how we engage with the dearest and nearest, as well as how we engage with strangers. And this is who we are. This is how we become who we are. So there are many important virtues that are embedded in these human relations, such as benevolence or co-humanity, such as ritual deference, such as wisdom, such as filial devotion or care, such as loyalty, such as, very importantly, justice, trustworthiness, and so on. Oh, I'm sorry. So in the Confucian worldview, these are the social determinants of a good life. We need benevolent politics in the public sphere with virtuous people. They don't have to be elites. So here, virtuous elites is an ancient Confucian term. Today, they can be any virtuous person serving the people. And the people should be and can only be governed through moral examples. So this idea of benevolent politics rule out tyranny, for example, rule out authoritarianism when the ruling parties are not giving moral examples in caring for the people. In the private sphere, virtuous conduct must follow the Tao of heaven. So in the Confucian tradition, this idea of the Tao of heaven is to believe that heaven, or the highest divine power, is moral. Heaven wishes us to be moral. So the Tao of heaven is a benevolent, moral way of life. And here, filial devotion, the care for parents and the elderly, is a key virtue. Now I'm going to think comparatively for a moment, think about the Greek philosopher of Greek philosophy, Julia Annett, who speaks of the morality of happiness for the ancient Greeks. So she says the ancient Greeks have concepts of morality through their theories of virtues, very much like the Confucians. And eudaimonia, what we think of as happiness, is in fact not egotistical or self-centered. In eudaimonia, we care about the well-being of others. And there is a religious dimension to eudaimonia, again, very similar to the Confucian tradition. But it doesn't have to be. Here's, I think, an important thing about the Confucian way of life. There is a religious Confucianism, as in, say, religious Christianity. But there's also a cultural Confucianism, the way we can speak of someone being a cultural Christian who may not be practicing religiously. So in Confucian texts, an ideal society that is for all under heaven, for all on earth, is called the Great Commonwealth or the Great Unity. I think it can simply be translated as a great common good, which is the goal for all of us to strive to achieve. I will skip this quotation and to refer to this wonderful, important book by Robert Bellah and his co-authors called Habits of the Heart. Many of you, I think, know about the book. It was published in 1985 and became an instant classic in understanding American individualism and commitment. So they speak of the 4 moral discourses or moral languages in American life. There's what they call the utilitarian individualism. Essentially, the individualism that says, I want what I want, and what I want is what brings me happiness. But in our American moral languages, we also have a tradition that's called by Bella and his co-authors, expressive individualism. Here we speak of authenticity, how to be our best self, our most authentic self. It is expressing our individual beliefs and values. And I shall quickly mention the other two traditions, the biblical tradition that is deeply rooted in American public life, that certainly cares about the common good, and the civic republicanism, which is indeed speaking of the common good through the republic, the ideal of the republic and people's involvement in governance and sharing power. One can speak of this in the Confucian Chinese society, where today there is the neoliberal discourse of capitalism and individual self-interest. And there's also the expressive individualism, as well as other individual religious beliefs of reasons to be. But I wish to emphasize that there are two other discourses of moral language. The first is Confucian ethical values. The second is actually the Chinese official discourse of the common good. Whether it is followed by the state is an entirely different issue, but that knowledge, that idea that the common good is an important part of a good society, of a fulfilling individual life, is, I think, very much visible in China, both in ancient China and contemporary China. I shall end with a reference to this very moving film called Into the Wild. Many of you have seen it, and if you have not, I cannot recommend it enough. And it is about this young man who wants to give up society because society is corrupt. He wishes to obtain purity by being in nature. And he died in a school bus, abandoned school bus in Alaska, completely alone. But these are the words that he copied in his notebook shortly before his death in the wilderness in Alaska. And this is from Tolstoy's book, Family Happiness. I have lived through much, and now I think I've found what is needed for happiness. A quiet, secluded life in the country with a possibility of being useful to people to whom it is easy to do good, and who are not accustomed to have it done to them. Then work which one hopes may be of some use. Then rest, nature, books, music, love for one's neighbor. Such is my idea of happiness. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anna. We're going to turn next to Professor Nathan Schneider. Professor Schneider teaches media studies at the University of Colorado Boulder, where he leads the Media Enterprise Design Lab and the MA program in Media and Public Engagement. Nathan, thank you.
Thank you. It's been such a pleasure to be part of this process. So grateful to be included in this conversation. I am going to speak from the perspective of the cooperative business movement, which is a kind of longstanding movement for economic justice, for solidarity economies, for businesses that are owned and governed by the people who participate in them. And for years, I've been involved in supporting this movement and co-founding an accelerator for new cooperatives, and particularly supporting the development of cooperatives in the digital economy, and enabling us to confront some of the kinds of deep accountability crises of the digital economy. But what I want to share today is a proposition that the cooperative movement is also really importantly, deeply understood as an educational movement, not just as a movement that does some education, but is profoundly about education. Now, this is a movement with many sources. Dominant in many respects narrative is that, it holds a bunch of principles that derive from a North English store in the 1840s, but it really draws from many, many more traditions, particularly indigenous traditions all around the world, which have practiced collaborative economies, as well as colonial traditions. In many colonial contexts, cooperatives were used as part of that colonial process, and people have, as part of decolonial processes, sought to transform their cooperative movements into something that truly serves them. Now, in those Rochdale principles from England in the 1840s that are still enshrined, adapted a bit, modified a bit, but enshrined in the cooperative identity statement of the International Cooperative Alliance today, education is one of the 7 cooperative principles, that cooperatives should advance education and that they should educate their members in particular to be better democratic subjects, to be better able to participate in the ownership and governance of their businesses. But I want to share a passage from a new edition of the reflections of a priest named Jose Maria Arizmendi Arrieta. I'm sure I totally butchered that name, the pronunciation in Basque, who was the founder of the Mondragon cooperatives in the Basque region of what is now known as Spain. He writes at one point in one of these passages, "It has been said that cooperativism is an economic movement that makes use of educational action. But we can just as well affirm that it is an educational movement that makes use of economic action." So he's really flipping the story, saying that, in fact, we should be thinking of education, or I'm sorry, of economics as a means toward education, and the education of the human person as the ultimate aim of economics. The cooperatives that he founded, the Mondragon Network, emerged in the context of fascist Spain in the 1950s. It emerged actually after about a decade of Father Arizmendi and his students working together, studying, exploring possibilities, learning together before they founded the first cooperative. And in that process, they instilled some values and some practices and habits that have made Mondragon the largest worker cooperative in the world, that has been often studied over the years, but never really copied. And the more I've explored this story, the more I think that this priority listing of putting the human person at the center, rather and turning economics into a means toward the end of human flourishing is at the core of actually its economic success. The Catholic context that Father Arizmendi was working in helps explain some of the function of this model. One is the context of distributism, which came out of the Rerum Novarum encyclical in the late 19th century of Pope Leo XIII, calling for distribution of ownership and stewardship and responsibility as a kind of solution to the problem of labor and capital. Distributivism as inviting people into stewardship. Then a movement of personalism, which was a kind of Catholic rejoinder to existentialism, centering the person as a critical source of dignity, but not living toward despair, living toward that dignity. And again, centering a kind of theology that recognized the making of the person as a vital endeavor. And a word that comes out of this context is that of formation, which is a word he used as well. The formation of the person as, again, the vital task of economics. I've been thinking about this a lot lately in the context of a moment where we are seeing decline of health and confidence in democracy worldwide. And on the one hand, I think back to the famous work of Alexis de Tocqueville, looking at the life of early democracy in the United States in the 1830s, and seeing the importance of everyday associations as a vital task of constructing a national democracy. He saw in those everyday associations the basis upon which the very possibility of democratic life could occur, and spoke very explicitly about those associations as educational mechanisms, democracy as an educational project. This is echoed in certain respects among people who Tocqueville's studies did not take nearly seriously enough, or in some cases forcibly erased. For instance, Jessica Gordon-Nembhard, who's the leading scholar and historian of African-American cooperative traditions, has stressed the role of study groups in the development of the cooperative tradition in Black communities in the US. I also think of the anti-colonial activist and writer C.L.R. James in his famous essay, "Every Cook Can Govern," imagining a world in which we are preparing everybody for power. And then his sometime collaborator, Grace Lee Boggs, a teacher and philosopher in the context of Detroit, Michigan in the United States, who taught a generation of activists to focus on critical connections, not critical mass, to recognize the power of small-scale, intimate human experience as a vital site of shaping our political possibilities. And this is something that I've now been focusing on a great deal in my own work, in thinking about where do we have space for democratic practice, for solidarity economies, for doing that kind of education where we can use economy as a site of education in the context of online lives. I find that there are very few such spaces, and I've become really passionate about trying to insert those kinds of spaces into the possibility, the range of possibilities in our online lives and experiences, to instill that sense of possibility that having some power can afford, having some power over one's economic life, having some power over one's political life. These are essential educational techniques that, as Father Arizmendi insists, are kind of core to our self-making as human persons. This cooperative tradition has, I think, is best understood in this sense, that it is not merely an economic instrument, that it uses economics as a means to develop people in their fullest sense. And I wonder where else we find ourselves, how we might rethink and reshape our economics to develop human people as the vital outcome of economic life. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Nathan. That raises a bunch of really important and interesting questions. I should encourage people, you mentioned kind of creating some of these vital spaces in online life together or on the internet. And I think Nathan has written some interesting pieces on Twitter and recent developments in that world. So it's worth checking out his thinking and writing on that. Finally, we're going to turn to Dr. Anthony Annett. Tony is an economist. He is an adjunct professor at Fordham University, and he is a senior advisor at the UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network. So Tony, it's all yours.
Great. Thanks a lot, Jesse. Thanks to everybody who organized this. I'm delighted to participate. It's nice to see some friendly faces from wonderful meetings we've had over the years, including at the Vatican. So it's good to see everybody. I've written a book as well as the Ethics in Action book. I've written my own book called Cathonomics, which basically argues that the principles of Catholic social teaching form a better foundation for the global economy than do the principles of neoclassical economics. And here I want to talk about one specific dimension of that, is how it affects education, in particular, how we teach economics and business, which I think is all wrong. But before I do that, let me just do a little share, usual thing here. And I want to start with SDG target 4.7, which you all know here. But this basically says we need to ensure all learners acquire knowledge and skills needed to promote sustainable development, including through education for sustainable development and sustainable lifestyles, human rights, gender equality, promotion of a culture of peace and nonviolence, global citizenship, appreciation of cultural diversity, and of culture's contribution to sustainable development. Now, that is basically pointing towards a modern 21st century version of ethical education. It's an updated version of what Plato and Aristotle talked about millennia ago. And in a sense, it follows directly from the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which, as you all know, was chaired by Eleanor Roosevelt, and whose drafters included a Lebanese Christian, a French Jew, and a Chinese Confucian. And they were all able to affirm these set of human rights that apply to all people in all countries of the world, even though they might have had different philosophical and anthropological reasons for agreeing to these rights. They were nonetheless able to agree to them. And Article 26 is about the right to education. It says education shall be free, it shall be compulsory, and made generally available, and higher education should be equally accessible to all on the basis of merit. And here's the key part, Article 26, Section 2, which is education shall be directed to the full development of the human personality and to the strengthening of respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms. It shall promote understanding, tolerance, and friendship among nations, racial or religious groups, and shall further the activities of the United Nations for the maintenance of peace. Now, that's very similar to SDG target 4.7. Target 4.7 merely updates that a little bit to include some of the more sustainability aspects which weren't so apparent back in 1948. But basically, we're talking about education is about the full development of the human character and personality. And in the area I work in, Catholic social teaching, this is related to something we call integral human development. And this is a quote from Pope Paul VI in 1968 of what he calls integral human development. And I'll quote that. The development we speak of here cannot be restricted to economic growth alone. To be authentic, it must be well-rounded. It must foster the development of each man and the whole man. As an eminent specialist on this question has rightly said, we cannot allow economics to be separated from human realities, nor development from the civilization in which it takes place. What counts for us is man, each individual man, each human group, and humanity as a whole. So this says that development is not just about economics. It's not just about GDP or money or stuff or possessions. It's about being more rather than just having more. It's about the development of the whole person across all dimensions. Yes, economic, but also social, political, emotional, artistic, cultural, and yes, religious. It's a very Aristotelian idea that you take a latent capacity for the good and you bring it to the full potential to become the best version of yourself through a life of reason and a life of virtue. And of course, from this perspective, this Aristotelian perspective, the true route to human flourishing is eudaimonia, is basically through education, mentorship, and good role models. But we have lost the idea of ethical education, the idea that education is vital, not just for knowledge and skills necessary for a productive livelihood, but also for character development and to develop pro-sociality, to develop an affinity for sustainable development, all these things. Now, obviously, economics is going to be very important. And here's the problem. Modern economics and business education works against all of this. It works against the development of education as seen as the development of character and virtue. because we know from the evidence that if students are taught the principles of neoclassical economics, they act out on those principles in real life. Those principles include self-interest, maximizing your own material interests, competition rather than sociality, rather than cooperation, and pro-sociality. Studies show that students with exposure to neoclassical economics are more likely to be selfish, opportunistic, dishonest, and antisocial. When they play economic games, they act like this fictitious homo economicus. They trust people less, they defect more, they cheat more, they cooperate less, and they tend to be less generous. We also know from papers that business and economics students display more of what are known as the dark triad traits: narcissism, psychopathy, and Machiavellianism. They seek power, status, and social dominance. Now, the question you might ask is, what is driving this? Is it self-selection? Are people with those traits somehow attracted to business and economics education? Or is it indoctrination? Are they learning this in what they study? And I think the answer to that is it's a bit of both. But indoctrination is very important because, as Aristotle and Aquinas taught us long ago, vice as well as virtue can be inculcated, can be habituated, and that tends to be what's going on. So the final slide I want to develop is, what are the 10 flaws of neoclassical economics that are taught to students that lead to these inculcation of bad values? And I think there are 10 of them. I'll just state them really quickly since I know we're running a bit late here and I don't want to keep people too long. One, it's all based on self-interest, goes back to Adam Smith. Whereas instead, I would argue that from the point of view of Catholic social teaching or from humane economics, you should be motivated by solidarity, by reciprocity, by gratuitousness. Number two is preferences are subjective and can't be questioned. You like what you like, and nobody has the right to tell you otherwise. It doesn't matter whether what you're seeking contributes to human flourishing or not. If you like gambling, go and gamble all your money away. That's what neoclassical economics says you should do. Your preferences are subjective. The third flaw is that all that matters are goods and services that can be purchased on the market. You maximize your utility based on consumption. There's no notion of integral human development or of being rather than having. Point number four is that wants are unbounded. The key word in neoclassical economics is maximization. You maximize your utility, you maximize your profits. Whereas in the tradition of Aristotle and Aquinas, it's much more about perfection than maximization. Your desires should be bounded, your needs should be limited, and lower order goods should always be subordinated to higher order goods. Relatedly, point number 5 says it offers a very weird view of rationality. Neoclassical economics says you're rational to the extent that you have preferences and you try to satisfy those preferences to the best extent possible. But in the tradition of Aristotle, rationality means something almost the opposite. It means you take the virtue of prudence or practical wisdom to figure out what is good for you and then to actively choose the good. So neoclassical economics from this vantage point is actually centered on the satisfaction of the appetites, which is the opposite of choices based on rationality and reason. It gets it upside down. Point number 6, it emphasizes competition rather than cooperation. That kind of obvious. Again, it's competition plus the division of labor plus self-interest allows the market to work its magic. Point number 7, it rules out all redistribution and is compatible with vast amounts of inequality. We become numb to the suffering of people that don't have property on the market. Number 8, the only rights that matter are property rights. That's for markets to work. We need property rights and contracts to be well specified and enforced. And there's no role for economic rights, rights to such goods as food, shelter, healthcare, education, just wages, or social protection. Number 9, it has a very crimped view of justice. The only form of justice is the justice between two individuals. There's no sense of justice in terms of what the community owes the individual or what the individual owes the community. There's no sense of duty or obligation. And finally, number 10, firms maximize profits. They're not supposed to have any social role whatsoever. So very quickly, that was a very quick bird's eye view, but those are 10 what I would call ethical flaws of neoclassical economics, and they are what lead economics education, business education to inculcate the wrong values in people that work against the integral human development, that work against the idea of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, that education should be directed towards the full development of the human personality and fundamental freedoms. So with that, Jesse, I will stop and turn it back over to you. Thank you.
Hey, thank you very much, Tony. So the only one question was raised in the chat, which was to Anna, and she addressed that. And I see we just have one more that just came in. Nancy's asking about moral and values education being offered through formal schooling versus other educational modes. I want to ask something basically on that topic, which comes out from your presentations. I think you all agree that education is intrinsically and instrumentally valuable, but your disciplines and your presentations seem to be predicated on like different theories of change as far as how that gets worked out in the real world. And by that, I mean, Professor Wolf is talking about the brain and the reader. Professor Sun's discussing social systems, relations, ritual relations being passed through time. Professor Schneider is talking about the cooperative movement, leveraging economic action towards the formation of the individual person. And Tony, on the one hand, discussed the human rights agenda at the international level and mentioned kind of business school as being one lever to pull to see change. So I'm wondering if you could each give one maybe critical recommendation or piece of advice, either to educators or people who are theorizing and thinking about education, keeping in mind the idea of a theory of change. And if we don't mind, let's go in reverse order. So Tony, can I put you on the spot?
Sure. Very quickly, in one sentence, I would say you need to reform the way you teach economics and business education. And I am part of an initiative that's trying to do exactly that. You need to ground business and economics training in a more humane economic system, in a more realistic account of human nature and human anthropology, and move away from this flawed conception of Homo economicus. So many students today are studying economics and business. They're very popular choices, but it needs to be taught correctly.
Thank you very much, Tony. Nathan.
Yeah, certainly an upshot of my talk is, although I like classrooms and believe in them and teach in them, I think we also need to recognize something very far-flung. For instance, the financial infrastructure of our society is right now very poor for enabling people to co-own and co-govern aspects of their economic lives. We've done it before. We have blueprints for how to do it, and we have in recent generations chosen not to. So I think we need the tools to be able to enable more people to experience the possibilities of economic democracy, and that's not education policy as we've tended to think about it. It's actually the financial system. It's corporate law, things like this. These actually have powerful educational consequences.
Absolutely. Anna.
I really like Nancy's questions. Thank you. And Jesse, thank you for your great summary. I have two points to make. The first is that I think we can reform formal education. We all get nervous when we hear religion in the classroom. But do you hear it's a singular religion? What if we teach religions in the classroom? I teach in a religious studies department. Our students take classes in Buddhism, Hinduism, Islam, Judaism, Christianity, Confucianism, you name it. And they come out richer, deeper people. They also see how humans are fundamentally alike in the desire for a better world, for the common good, in fact. So I think bringing in a more comparative understanding of religion into the classroom is an important step. The next part is, very briefly, is that I think informal education is essential as well. Children are learning and young people are learning from the internet, from YouTube. So there are lots of opportunities for us as scholars, as activists, to do more with the informal channels of learning.
Thank you, Anna. And finally, to Maryanne.
So I think, well, first it was a joy to hear all of you. It's just truly, it helps me think in new ways. It's not just how I want to teach you how I think. I want to always integrate what I think are unbelievably interesting perspectives. And that's really where I begin. I think education has to be reformed so that the 6-year-old, not the 16-year-old, the 6-year-old begins to think about empathy, perspective taking, and what does something mean? What is the author saying? And what does that mean to us? Proust had this beautiful line that the heart of reading is to go beyond the wisdom of the author to discover our own. I'd like that principle, that Proustian principle, to be believed, that we can reach our best thoughts, but that we have to think differently about ourselves and others. And perspective taking and critical analysis. Anna was using her frontal lobes when she was talking about neuro. I love that, because that's really what happens. The frontal lobes are having this dance, and then they check and see what is the truth. Well, the emphasis on truth, justice, and beauty, and the emphasis on understanding how other people think, I think should be at the essence of what we're doing, and not to forget beauty. I think we are, beauty is one of the powerful ways that we enter and go outside ourselves.
Thank you so much. Those are beautiful closing words. Thanks so much to our panelists, to the organizers of the summit, including Radhika Yengar, Jasmine Mora, Hayan Shin, and Sonia Neve, and many others. I've learned a lot and hope that we've all taken away not just new bits of information, but some wisdom and insight to take action. And in the words of Proust, may you please go beyond the wisdom of our panelists, though deep it may be, and continue to work for good in the world. So thank you very much and have a great rest of your afternoon.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Thank
It was
Bye.
really
Pleasure to be
Thank you
here.
so
Thank you
much.
all.